And it's in His name that we pray. Amen.
Morning. We're going to go through a series of sermons entitled The Plan, and it's talking about the plan that Jesus had and how He intended to achieve His plan, how He intended to get His goals done. And we'll start here today, and then we're going to go through every Sunday in March until Easter and talk about the plan that Christ had. So if it's your first week, great. This is a great week to be here. First week starting out. Every Sunday in March, except for this one, has something strange about it. This one is just a regular Sunday, but then next Sunday is the dreaded time change. I don't know if you remember that or not, how that feels, but you will next week. And it'll sneak up on you like a bad dream. And then the week after that, the 17th, is St. Patrick's Day. And I guess we'll all wear green. And then the Saturday after that is Palm Sunday. Sunday after that, Palm Sunday, and then Easter. And so this whole month, just taking a chance to look at Christ's plan. Now, I was thinking about something that I don't know why it didn't really occur to me when I was younger. It didn't that much, but it has as I've gotten older. Is that Jesus dies a relatively young man. I mean, he's not. Even when it's all over for him, he's still a pretty young man. And I remember. Not really paying attention to that when I was a young guy myself, but as I get older, I think that's interesting because, you know, a young guy has so much to live for and so much out there that they're wanting to accomplish or get done. I remember getting further in the rearview mirror, but I remember when I was a young man thinking about different things I wanted to get done, you know, different dreams I had, different plans that I had. And I've known a lot of guys in their late teens, early 20s that come out with some pretty intense plans, things that they intend to get done by a certain point. Sometimes it has to do with family, where it's like you kind of come in a bad family, and so, okay, my family's going to be different. And sometimes it's not family, it's more work. Like I want to really be known for what I do. I want to be well known for what I do. For some people, it's about money. I want to have a certain amount of money by the time I'm 40 years old or 50 years old. I want to be able to retire earlier. I want to have a big house. And none of those things are in themselves wrong or good or bad, either one. They're just dreams that people have. And I think it's interesting. The lengths that some people go to achieve their dreams. I remember a friend of mine in college who had a girl that he really liked, but he was afraid that she wouldn't help him. She was going to hold him back to doing things that he intended to do. So he broke up with her pretty fast. I don't know why it sticks in my head, but it does. And I've known people who do that with their friends. You know, here's some friends that will help me get where I want to go, and here's some friends that won't. Certainly we do it with our college. We pick a college that we think will help us get there, or we apprentice with people who we think are going to take us the direction we need to go. And so I was thinking about all that with Jesus here as He's making His plan and as He's announcing His plans to the other guys. Because the guys who followed Jesus, especially those disciples, they were young, ambitious guys too. And they had plans, you know. They wanted to achieve certain things and get certain things done and make something out of their life, just like everybody does. And some of the guys were already married, and maybe their big goal was to have a business or a house or a family, you know, that was safe. A lot of guys were thinking more national. You know, Israel had went through some pretty rough years there, and so we're going to follow Jesus and make a better Israel. And I think some of the guys wanted to be famous and wanted to be important and wanted to be rich and make things happen, and so there's a story just to kind of give where Jesus' plans and their plans all kind of collide, and it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and it pops up in Matthew and Mark and Luke, and I like Mark's version the best, but it's in all three of them, and it's all good reading. It was a kind of a famous conversation that goes on between Jesus and the other guys. It says in Mark there, they were on their way to Jerusalem, and Jesus is leading the way. And the disciples were astonished, and those who followed were afraid. And he doesn't really tell us why they're astonished and afraid, but you can kind of pick up from the way the story goes is that they can see things are escalating. They can see people are starting to really turn out in big numbers. They're getting more opposition. There weren't newspapers then, but if there were newspapers then, they're in all the papers. People are talking about these guys all the time. They're a big hit. They're going viral, you know, in Israel as much as a person can go viral in first century Israel. And people are wanting to find out about them. And so Jesus is making his way, and he's leading, and all the guys are like, okay, what's going to happen next? And they're hoping that their dreams and Jesus' dreams are going the same direction. And so he calls them. Jesus calls a meeting with his disciples, has them all come and says, here's what we're getting ready to do. And then he lays it out. We're going to go to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and they're going to condemn him to death. And the Son of Man, he's talking about himself. And Jesus, he says, they're going to condemn me, Jesus, to death. He says, they're going to hand me over to the Gentiles who will mock and spit and flog and kill me. But 3 days later, I'll come back. And this is the third time Jesus has tossed this out to the disciples. He's told them all of these things. And the first time he told them, it shocked Peter bad enough that Peter said, never. That's not going to happen, Jesus. Don't even worry about it. We'll stand in there. We'll protect you, and you're letting the stress get to you or something. But he's popped it up 2 or 3 times now. And nobody really rebukes Jesus on this. Let's kind of listen to him. But it's like he's saying it over and over again, because this is it. I mean, this is not like a metaphor for something else. This is exactly where we're headed. This is exactly why we're heading there. This is the point. Now, and one thing that's kind of hard to appreciate in America compared to that part of the world is it's very much an honor-shame-based society. How your family and how you looked compared to other people, were you held in honor or were you ashamed? That meant a big difference. That meant it was a big deal. And a lot of the language, especially on this slide, is shame kind of language. They're not just going to kill Jesus, but they're going to mock him, and they're going to spit on him, and they're going to hand him over to the foreigners, and he's going to die ashamed. He's going to die small. And that shame deal, especially in the first century, was such an unthinkable thing, just such an unbelievable thing. And they don't really correct him on it, but you have to wonder what they were thinking. I mean, were they taking him serious when he was saying this thing? Did they believe it? Did they think it was a metaphor somehow, that they were just missing some deeper, truth he was talking about? Like, they never really talk about it. He tells them and they listen to it, but they never really have a conversation. And I wonder, is not really related to the sermon exactly, but when I think about that story and think about Jesus in that moment, did that hang on him all the time? I've known a couple people through my life who have been told by the doctor, you've got this many more months to live, or this many more days or weeks to live. And I think getting that kind of news from the doctor, it would just hang over your head every minute. I mean, it would affect every conversation you had after something like that was said. You would think about it. It would be hard to get it out of your head. And is Jesus doing that? Is he able to think about it? Is that all he thinks about? Does it just pop up in weird moments and he thinks about it again? Was it a weight on him? I mean, it would have been on me. And did any of the disciples kind of get it? I mean, a lot of them didn't, but did any of them get it? Did any of them start to think, man, if we follow this guy, this may be where we head? I don't know if that even occurred to them or not. I don't know if that even registered exactly. But anyway, that's the tone of the conversation. And then the very next word is then. So right after that, Jesus tells that story, and then, so we don't know how long then is. Then might be like the next minute. Like Jesus says, hey, bad news, I'm going to get crushed. Oh, okay, well, Jesus, while we're talking, it could be that, or it could be a day or two later. We don't know how long then is, but you kind of have the sense that it was pretty fast, that Jesus has just taken these guys and unloaded this really heavy bit of news. And then right after that, James and John, these are 2 brothers, and they're 2 of the disciples, and they're guys, young guys with dreams and plans and ambitions. And they come to Jesus and they say, teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask, which is the kind of thing a kid asks a parent. And Jesus says, well, what do you want me to do for you? And they say, well, let one of us sit on your right and the other on your left in your glory. And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. Did you just hear what I said? I mean, it's actually kind of a curious thing. In the book of Mark, the right and left, actually, there's a phrase. It's like 3 words in Greek, but it's all together in the Greek. The English splits it up a little bit. But let us sit on the right and left. Right and left is how it is. 3 words there together in the Greek. And that pops up one other time in the book of Mark. And it's when he's on the cross, and there's thieves on his right and left. Right? It's the only time it pops up. And so Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. I mean, when I'm in my glory, that's going to be some rough sledding. He says, and he kind of, again, does do as a metaphor here. He says, can you drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism that I'm baptized with? And no, we can, they said. Because again, they don't understand what he's saying. They don't believe it. And Jesus says, well, you will drink the cup I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with, but to sit at my right and left is not for me to grant. He says those places belong to whoever God has in mind. And you can picture the disciples, James and John, smiling at this. Okay, we're going to get the cup. Because they don't know, right? Okay, we're getting the baptism. You heard what he said. Maybe even looking at the other guys. We're getting the baptism. We're getting the cup. Because they don't know what he's saying, and they don't totally get it, and they don't totally understand. You can picture them kind of nodding and feeling good about themselves that they jumped in there early. And the other 10 disciples, they see it, and it says they were indignant that James and John would do it. And you could read it two different ways. I mean, it's possible they were saying, how could you ask Jesus that after what he just said? It's possible they were indignant for that reason. But probably not, because Jesus is going to turn around and kind of bark at all of them a little bit here. He's kind of going to teach them all a lesson. So probably they're indignant because we should have asked. Now look here, James and John are getting a cup. We don't get a cup. And then they're mad about that. And again, not knowing exactly what it is that he's talking about. And so Jesus calls them all together again. He just called them all together to say he was going to head to the cross. Now he's called them all together again. And he says, you know those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and the high officials exercise authority. And what Jesus is talking about here is this is the way of the world. You give somebody a little bit of authority, and it will often go to their head. And by the way, we all know what that feels like, right? Every one of us has had to talk to somebody who barked at us, not because they were smarter or more talented or any of those kinds of things. They just had power in that moment. And they had control in that moment, and they liked to throw their authority around. All of us know what it's like to have a bad boss who just likes to throw their authority around, who just likes to bark at people because they can. It's such a common problem, right? It's such a common thing, and has always been a common thing. It's not brand new. He says, you know how people are, Jesus says. You know how people are. You give them a little bit, and next thing you know, they turn into a monster. He says, but not so with you. You know how they all act, but not so with you, he says. He says, we're going to go a different direction. All the rest of the world is striving to get to the first and second place. They want to be important. They want to be seen. They want to be famous and successful and rich and well-known, but not so with you. Now, it's not that those things couldn't happen to one of you, and if it does, fine, but that's not the kind of thing we're after, he says. He says, we're not shooting for those kinds of things. He says, not so with you. We're trying for something different than everybody else. He says, whoever wants to become great amongst you must be a servant, and whoever wants to be first place has to be slave of all. I was listening to this podcast. I've not been on it very long. There's a podcast, Nate Bargatze has a podcast called Nateland. And a few months ago, he was on Saturday Night Live, and he has a podcast where he talks about going there. And I found it a lot more interesting than I thought I would. I don't know why. The whole thing was more, the idea, I'll never be on Saturday Night Live, but it was interesting to see what a person has to go through when they're doing that, and what that whole show's been on forever. And anyway, he gets invited to be on it, and so he shows up Sunday the week before, and they start working. He talks about the whole process, and he says what was interesting about it is they're just trying to make me look good the whole time. I got one person who's beside me all the time, walking me around, making sure I get to where I need to go. There's a person in charge of costumes and wigs and in charge of set design. And if somebody has an idea, hey, when Nate Bargatze was on there, one of the skits was a lake. And we want to build a lake here in this studio. And if they ask you to do it, you're not allowed to say no. All right, let's give it a shot, Because a lot of times in work, people will say no, not because they can't do it, they just don't want to, right? So you're not allowed to do that because we're here to serve. And he says that they were writing stuff. They asked me at the beginning of the week, what kind of things are you comfortable with, in terms of comedy? And we talked about it a little bit. And they wrote, and they were trying to make me look good. There's a skit when he was on it. He plays George Washington in one skit. It's really funny. And people have said, man, that was a funny skit that you wrote. And he goes, I didn't write it. They wrote it. But then they're trying to write it so it sounds like me. their whole week is they're just trying to make me look good. We get to the end of the week, and it's like he says, we do a dress rehearsal, and we're 9 minutes too long, which you can't be, or you can't be long. We're 9 minutes too long. And so he said, I talked to Lauren Michaels. He's in charge of Saturday Night Live. He said, I talked to Lauren Michaels. I said, hey, I can cut my monologue back a little bit. He goes, oh, no, that was perfect. You sounded really good. Let's keep that. Because again, the whole point is everybody's lifting everybody else up. Everybody's trying to make everybody else look good. And it really has kind of pervaded the whole culture. I mean, some of the guys who are working for Saturday Night, most of the guys who are working for Saturday Night Live have worked there the whole time. There's several dozen people who have been there 30 years, running electric and doing costumes and sets and props. They don't want to leave. Once they get in that environment, they don't want to leave. And I'm listening to this podcast and thinking Saturday Night Live is more Christian than most churches are, which was a weird thing to think, right? It's a weird thing to get in your head. But that's what it is. I mean, the whole notion, and by the way, I'm not so naive to think that Saturday Night Live is like a church. So I know it's probably not like a church. But that idea, that notion that we're all just building each other up, right? I mean, the whole point of this thing is, how can I make you look good? What do I need to do to make you look good? How can I sacrifice so you can come out ahead? And a whole group of people who are focused on that target. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He says, the rest of the world just looks out for themselves, but not so with you. Instead, we're going to serve most, and we're going to give most, and we're going to lift up the most. And the whole function of a church is people competing with each other to make other people look good. When the church is running like the church is supposed to run, that's the attitude. It's not hard to find volunteers because everybody wants to jump in. You know, most of the time, if we're being honest, and I'm speaking for myself here too, you hear the word volunteer, you start thinking, what can I afford? Well, what can I afford? Can I afford the time? Can I afford the energy? And that's not how you think, Jesus says. Not anymore. That's how the rest of the world thinks, but not here, he says. We're going to go a different direction. We're going to be a different kind of people. And, you know, any good coach leads the way, right? They do it first. And Jesus says, he says, that's me. He says, the Son of Man. Again, talking about himself with the Son of Man. Even the Son of Man, Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve. To give his life as a ransom for many. Most of us would rather be on the be served part of it. But Jesus says, we didn't come to be served. I didn't come to be served, and it's not so with you. We did not come to be served, but to serve. This is his mission statement for himself. And so because he's our leader, it becomes our mission statement too. We did not come to be served, but to serve. I remember the first time I was talking to a waitress. Cracker Barrel, awards you a stars. And I was talking to this, the stars on the apron there, and I was talking to a waitress at Cracker Barrel, and she was a 4-star waitress. It was just interesting how, again, I'll never be on Saturday Night Live. I'll probably never be a 4-star waitress. But it was interesting to me to hear how all that stuff was working together and what you had to do to get ahead and what the rewards were for getting ahead. And she was a 4-star waitress. And I said, I bet sometimes it's really a pain, isn't it, having to, we were talking about some of the awful stories. And as she's telling these stories, what struck me was how many of the awful stories were Christians after church. 20 Christians come in after church and take up 4 tables, and at the end of it, they tip $6 total, and they're there for 2 hours. And I thought, well, man, that can't be. That's a fluke, right? And she says, no, it happens a lot. In fact, there's some people who don't like to work Sunday because of that. They would rather work any other time but Sunday because the tips are usually bad, the crowd is usually bad. Big crowds, low tips, and they don't want to do it. And I thought, oh man, how's that even possible? It's people who have forgotten their marching orders. We didn't come to be served, but to serve. And Jesus, not just that, but he said, I came to give my life as a ransom for many. You well know what ransom means. A person gets kidnapped, and the kidnapper says, well, here's the ransom. You got to pay this much money to get them out. And if it's somebody that you really, really love and really, really care for, you might pay anything to get them out, whatever you got to pay, you do it because you don't even think about it. Whatever I got to pay, I want to pay just to make it work out. And Jesus says, you were captive to this world and captive to the devil. And he says, I paid the ransom for you. I can't, but it didn't just cost him money, it cost him everything. So what he was talking about earlier about getting killed and flogged and beaten, all that, he says, that's the plan. That's why I came, is to give my life as a ransom for you. I came, he says, my whole dream is to lay everything down to buy you back. So when we talk about service and being a servant, Jesus exemplifies it. When whatever I have to do, Jesus says, whatever I have to give, whatever I have to be, whatever I need to become so I can lift you up, he says. That's my dream. And that's who we follow. And that's the competing worldview that we kind of talk about. And it's an amazing thing. We sing songs like Amazing Grace, and it is an amazing thing. If you know, in some of the wars, in the wars, if you were a really rich person and you were drafted, you could have a poor person take your place. You know, in like Middle England and European wars and stuff. If you were a really rich person, you could pay a certain fee and have a poor person take your place so you wouldn't have to serve. And if God had given us a system like that, like, you know, you deserve to go to hell, well, I'll pay this, God, and get out of it, right? Or I'll do this and get out of it, right? And if God had given us a system like that, that would be grace. But that God says, I'm going to give you a system like that, but I'll pay for it. All you've got to do is ask, and I'll pay. That's even more grace. But the idea that Jesus here says, and I'll be the payment. It'll be me. I'll lose everything so you can go up. It's just staggering stuff. And I don't think the disciples totally understood it. I don't think they could. But he says, this is what we're talking about here, and this is the cup of Christ, and this is the baptism of Christ, to lay your life down to bless others. That we love others, and as we love others, we're loving God, and that we're taking this world someplace. It's just staggering stuff to think about. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. I just every time I read it, I get chills. Even talking to you about it, I could talk about it longer. There's just so many things in my head about this thing that's staggering. Well, the next word, just like before, there's that word then, and see the very next word is then again. So we don't know if this was like immediately, like he talks to all of them, and then this happened like the next second, or like 2 minutes later, or 5 minutes later, or a week later, but it was real close. So first he says, I'm going to have to go die, and then he has this long conversation about greatness, and then they came to Jericho, and Jesus and his disciples, they were a big crowd with them, and they see a blind man begging. His name Bartimaeus, means son of Timaeus, and he's sitting by the roadside there. And it wasn't an uncommon thing to see a blind man begging. Blind people would have had no way to get ahead in that world. There was no government assistance. There was no Disabilities Act to make things easier. There was nothing. You're on your own. And in our day, in America in 2024, it's not unusual to see somebody at the intersection of an interstate with a cardboard sign begging. It's not unusual to see that. But in that day, much more common, much more regular. You'd see guys like that begging because they had no other option. And here's this guy begging. And as they're coming into town, this guy starts kind of amping it up. He hears it as Jesus. So he starts calling out to him, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And the people say, calm that down. You know, shut up. We're trying to get someplace. And you can get really impatient about it. You know, you see somebody hurting there and you want to do something for them, but at the same time, I've got things to do too. And, you know, we don't have time for this, Jesus. We're in a hurry. We're in a rush. Son of David, have mercy on me. And so Jesus finally stops and says, well, call him. Well, they call the blind. Hey, cheer up. Good news. He wants to see you. And then the crowd totally changes. You know, 1 second they're against him. Now, hey, well, let's see what happens. So the guy gets up and he goes over to Jesus. And Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Yeah, I just want to see. And I highlighted the question there because if in our section we've been reading, it's the second time that question's popped up. Just a couple of verses ago, Jesus asked James and John, what do you want me to do for you? And they said, we want to be great. We want to sit on your right and left side. And Jesus doesn't totally give them what they're asking for. But he asks the very same question to this guy. Just 10 verses later. What do you mean to do for you? I just want to see. And I think there is some metaphor stuff going on here. I think there really was a man named Bartimaeus. This story pops up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think it happened, and it happened just like this. But I think all these guys, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, saw the connection between this question and the question he's just asking. Okay, wait a minute, there's more going on here. This guy just wants to know what's real, what's true, what's out there. I just want to see. And Jesus says, yes, I can make that happen. Because greatness in his mind is living like he sees it and living with truth. And his ambition it's just a powerful thing. And as a subtle note here, the man gets his vision, it says in this verse, and immediately starts to follow Jesus. See, I think if I'd been blind for a long time and got my eyes back, I'd want to go back to my family, or I'd want to go back to my friends. Hey, look, I'm back. And this guy doesn't want to do any of that. He wants to, like he's figured it out. And this is what's going on. And he doesn't want to leave. And all this guy's dreams get changed in a flash. Like I said, the whole story is cool. And I like the whole thing. Every time I read it, it makes me think, and it's one of my favorite stories in Scripture. But I think there's a couple things I want you to pull out of it. And a couple things I want you to take away from it if you can, and hopefully that you can go home with. The first one is that Jesus defines greatness differently than anybody else ever has. And that's such a big, gigantic deal, and we can miss the import of it. A lot of people have dreams or plans or hopes, right? And most of those dreams or plans or hopes deal with your advancement or your comfort or your success. And it's not necessarily wrong to have those kinds of thoughts or those kinds of dreams. It's not. But Jesus says the higher goal of greatness in God's kingdom may involve you going the other direction. It may involve you giving without getting a thank you back. It may involve you serving when nobody really notices, or if they do notice, they don't appreciate it. Or if they do notice, they take advantage of it. I mean, sometimes going Jesus' direction means that you try to be kind to someone who won't be kind back to you. You try to show grace to someone who's not going to show grace the other direction. Sometimes following Jesus is going to feel little, and it won't feel great. There's a whole Wikipedia page devoted to people who had the great tied to their name. There's dozens of names of people through history. I mean, some that are really famous, like Alexander the Great or Catherine the Great, or Muhammad Ali was the greatest. You know, different people had that. But a lot of people, who, ironically, who I had no idea who they were. It was sometime in history, people came around and said, "Hey, they're great," and I don't even know who they are. It's like it completely faded. And whatever it was that they accomplished. There was a man on the list named Herod the Great. He pops up in the Bible. Herod the Great was called the Great because he kind of unified all of what's currently Israel, Palestine into one kingdom, and he controlled it really ruthlessly, and he built up a lot of things and did a lot of construction, a lot of projects, but just a monster of a human being. He collected all that power by being cruel and by being violent, and when he got the power, he continued to be violent and cruel. And anybody came along who looked like a threat, he would get rid of them. It was nothing for Herod to kill people, even in his own family. He killed 2 wives and 3 sons who he thought were looking at him wrong. And he knew that at the end of his life, Herod knew at the end of his life that people would, they'd be glad when he died. I mean, he knew people would be glad. So he called together like 30 of the most popular people in the kingdom. When he's on his deathbed, he called together and he brought them all to a city, and he told his people, when you hear that I die, kill all of them, so people will be crying when I die. And he died, and his guards didn't carry it out, but that was the plan. So nobody cried when Herod died. They were all kind of glad he was gone. Now, during Herod the Great's lifetime, there was another person born. Just insignificant. In fact, Herod tried to kill him because he heard he was going to be trouble. And that's Jesus. And Jesus went a whole different direction. He just continued to give. And in a lot of ways made himself little. And little always, especially in American English, little always kind of comes off like an insult. I found that out several years ago. If you want to passively, aggressively insult somebody, just put little into your conversation more than you do. Oh, that's your little car, isn't it? Or whatever. Or, how's your little job going? Really, little in there, it really, in almost any regard, is a little passive-aggressive dig at whatever the other person's done. And they're saying, hey, I got an award at my work. Oh, let's see that little award. It really doesn't matter. You just toss little in there, and you can do it real subtle, like you don't mean nothing by it, but they'll catch it. They'll know what you're doing, and it'll dig a little. And Jesus is little. He comes in little and serves more. And today, I bet most of you couldn't tell me 10 things Herod the Great, or for that matter, Alexander the Great, or for that matter, Catherine the Great ever did. But Jesus changed everything. When you think about the values that we hold as a country, left and right, Republican and Democrat, things like equality and diversity and consent, the autonomy of our own body, the compassion, these are all Jesus ideas. Nobody in the ancient world felt like this. And it wasn't that he enforced his ideas with an army or a lot of money. As far as we can tell, none of those guys had any money. Jesus dies poor, and all of his disciples did too. From every record we have, none of them had any property or titles. All of them sacrificed everything. One of the guys who comes on really quickly after Jesus dies is a guy named Saul of Tarsus. And Saul was already kind of a big deal, but he hears about Jesus, and he hears about Jesus' way of life, and he has a vision of Christ there, and he changes everything, just completely upends his life to spread the news, and changes his name from Saul, which was a king's name, to Paul, which means little. And that little guy changed everything. It's an amazing thing, this greatness vision of Jesus, and how it wars and competes with the stuff that we have in mind. And if you really follow Jesus' plan on this thing, it may take your name off of a couple of trophies. It may mean that you have to sacrifice when other people aren't sacrificing, and it may mean that you have to give when it's not appreciated. And I can appreciate how somebody might not want to do that. But Jesus kind of measures greatness that way. It's faithfulness. I went to a funeral a few days ago, and they were talking at the funeral. This guy died a few years after his wife, and they both were able to live until their 90s. And for years, for like 60 years, they would host a dinner Sunday after church, and all the kids were invited. And then the grandkids, and then the great-grandkids, and any of their friends who wanted to come over. A lot of times they'd have 30 or 40 people in the house. And he wasn't rich, just a truck driver, and not all the family went to church. Everybody knew you couldn't get there too early because they were going to go to church first, and we'd all come in the afternoon. And they did this for like 6 decades. And at the funeral, when they're talking about this guy and how amazing he was and what a great dad and grandpa and great-grandpa he was, this is the stuff they talked about, this getting together for a meal. Just getting together and hanging out. And I remember hearing that story and just thinking, man, that's what it's all about. You think about the sacrifice of that. Cooking's hard. And you don't really get appreciated for it. You put all that stuff out there, and people say it tastes good, but a lot of times you'll be the only one washing dishes afterward. You're the only one cleaning up afterward, and everybody takes their meal and they go home, and that's what we all do. But for 60 years, and at the end of his life, this is what they're all talking about. Man, this guy was a giver. Man, anybody come in his house was welcome. Anybody that came in his house knew they were going to get taken care of. And when they're talking about what a great guy he was, it was that. It's kind of like when you guys have heard it, that it costs so much money to raise a kid. It's in Indiana. If you have a kid today, from now until they graduate high school, it costs about $200,000 to raise a kid in Indiana. Nationally, it's a little higher. Indiana's a little cheaper than the national average, but it's about $200,000 to raise a kid. Now, if they stay after high school, if they're still on your couch at 40, it's even more money. But if you can get them out of there by 18, it's like about 200. It's like $19,000 a year to raise a kid. And I've talked to people at different times, sometimes younger people, who will say things like, well, I'm not sure we can afford that, or I'm not sure we can afford to do that, when you think about the money. And it's funny, dads especially, more than moms will, dads will joke about it with each other. Like, every time I see that kid, it's $20, or whatever, or not sure how we're affording to feed them, they're eating all that money, and we tease about it. But it's a weird way to evaluate the worth of another human being. It's a strange thing that we do there. I measure you by how much inconvenience you are to me. I know some people who don't have children, who can't have children, who would easily pay $19,000, would write that check tomorrow, would take loans at the bank to pay for it they don't have, would much rather have that than a house or a car or those kinds of things. I mean, there's something in us that knows when you create a kid that you're creating something that's eternal, and it's not just like anything else. And a weird thing happens. I've known some people who were pretty wild, stupid, crazy people in their 20s, and then they have a kid, and suddenly it's like Mr. Rogers and whoever Mrs. Rogers would be, and there's like the whole thing changes, right? This person who had a lampshade on his head 6 months ago, now he's out there mowing the yard, and he's trying to work a little extra hours to pay for things. Having that kid changes you. To have somebody in the house there that I'm responsible for, the burden of it, you think it's going to be this big sacrifice, and it turns out it's not like that at all most of the time. You become a whole different person. And you see in that relationship what greatness really is. It's not about you controlling everything, because anybody who has a kid knows you don't control very much at all. It's about the service part of it. And yeah, they're expensive. People are expensive. People take a lot of work. And not just kids. Neighbors take a lot of work, right? Co-workers take a lot of work. Spouses, husbands and wives. Not in my case, but for the rest of y'all, it takes a lot of work. So I want to say a special word to all the people right now who are putting up with folks, who have difficult spouses or difficult children, headache neighbors, co-workers who continue to take advantage. I want to say a word to the one who feels put upon by people who don't appreciate all their talent and gifts and success, the ones who don't recognize your greatness, even though it's so obvious to you. I want to say a word to those people today and let you know there's a better way to live your life. And Jesus calls us to something much more meaningful than that. And sometimes it involves losing. But you'll win in the end. And you'll win a lot more before the end than you know than you're going to expect. There's just a better way to go. And the rest of the world's going a different direction trying to get there, but not us. Let me pray for you. Dear Lord God, I thank you for this group. I pray for them. And God, I don't know who all's going through what today. I expect all sorts of different things going on that I'm not aware of. So I just pray, God, you meet us where we're at. We're just dust and ashes. We're just sinners. And we come to you today, God, and we need your hand and we need your grace. And Father, again, reach out to us. Help us, God, to be what you are and to be where you are. And teach us, God, how to give like you do. And Father, for anybody in here who needs your hand today, I pray that you give it to them.